Relax, Webb, whatever your name is. It's just a coin. Men died next to me for that coin. You don't get to put it in your pocket like a souvenir. Aggressive? You broke into...
For 16 years, Marcus Webb had answered to names that didn't appear on any public record. Commander, Ghost. Sometimes just Sir, spoken low and fast by men who trusted him with their lives in places that never made it into a headline. He had led men through buildings that were not supposed to exist on any map, through nights so dark that the only light came from muzzle flashes and the green wash of night vision. He had carried wounded teammates over his shoulder for half a mile under fire and never once raised his voice doing it. Now he stood in the middle of his late mother's living room in Cedar Hollow, staring at a stack of moving boxes, and the silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. It had been 3 weeks since the medical retirement ceremony, 3 weeks since a combat applications group commander with a chest full of citations had become on paper just another civilian. The transition had been faster than the Army's paperwork could keep up with. 1 week he was briefing a room full of officers on extraction logistics. The next he was standing in a kitchen that smelled like his mother's cooking, even though she had been gone for 2 years, trying to remember how a person was supposed to spend a Tuesday afternoon with nothing scheduled and no one's life depending on his next decision. He hadn't expected the silence to be the hard part. He had braced for nightmares, for the flashbacks the VA counselors warned him about, for his body to betray him in restaurants when a door slammed too loud. What he hadn't braced for was this, the specific suffocating weight of having nowhere urgent to be. Combat had a rhythm, tension release, a heartbeat you could set a watch to. Civilian life had no rhythm at all. It simply continued, indifferent, expecting him to find his own pulse inside it. He exhaled, set down the box cutter, and looked around the room his mother had raised him in. The wallpaper was the same faded yellow it had been when he was 12. The window still stuck halfway when you tried to open it. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. Cedar Hollow had changed plenty, though. He'd noticed it on the drive-in 3 weeks earlier, the for sale signs sprouting on lawns that used to belong to families who'd lived there for generations. The new coffee shop 2 blocks down with a name that sounded like it had been generated by a marketing firm, the way half the houses on Lindell Street now had little black surveillance cameras mounted under their eaves, pointed not at driveways, but at the street itself. A new streetlight camera had gone up at the corner just last month. He'd watched the city crew install it, a small mechanical eye blinking to life above a neighborhood that had existed just fine without it for 60 years. There was a word for what was happening to Cedar Hollow, and Marcus had heard it used in city council meetings. He'd skimmed online redevelopment, revitalization words that always seemed to arrive with a smile and leave with someone else's home in their pocket. The patrol cars had gotten thicker on these streets too, not because crime had spiked. He'd checked the public data out of habit, an old intelligence officer's reflex, but because someone somewhere had decided that more eyes meant more safety, and nobody had bothered asking the people who already lived there whether they agreed. He carried a box of books to the shelf his father had built 30 years ago and set it down carefully. Inside, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a small glass display case. He unwrapped it slowly, the way another man might unwrap something fragile and irreplaceable, because to him it was exactly that. A Bronze Star. A Purple Heart he rarely mentioned to anyone, and beneath them, in a small velvet slot built into the case, a single brass unit coin heavier than its size, suggested the kind of object that meant nothing to a pawn shop and everything to the men who had earned theirs alongside him. The coin had been a gift from his team, presented to him the night before a mission that had taken 2 of those men and brought the rest of them home changed. He didn't display it for pride. He displayed it because some nights when the silence pressed too hard against his chest, he needed to look at it and remember that the weight he carried had a name, a shape, a reason. He set the case on the mantel, adjusted it until it sat level, and stood back. The medals didn't make noise. They didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer. They simply existed the way memory existed, present, heavy, and entirely his own. A knock came at the side door light, familiar sounding already after just 3 weeks. He recognized the rhythm before he even turned around. "You're either unpacking or you're hiding from your own boxes," came a woman's voice through the screen door, warm with the kind of teasing that only comes from someone who has decided to be kind to you, whether you've earned it yet or not. Donna Reyes stood on the small concrete step between their 2 yards, a dish towel still in one hand like she'd walked over mid-chore and hadn't bothered putting it down. She was in her early 50s, sturdy and quick-eyed with the particular alertness of someone who had spent 20-some years working ER shifts and had long since stopped being surprised by anything life threw at her. "Bit of both," Marcus said, stepping out onto the porch. "Turns out 16 years of deployments doesn't prepare you for assembling a bookshelf." Donna laughed a real laugh and leaned against the porch rail. "Welcome to the neighborhood for real this time. I've been meaning to come by properly since you moved in, but work's been a circus." She nodded toward the house. "This was your mama's place, right, Miss Eleanor?" "You knew her." "Everybody knew, Miss Eleanor. She brought me a casserole the week my husband left. Didn't even ask if I wanted one. Just put it in my hands and told me to eat something." Donna's smile softened. "I'm sorry about her passing. She'd be glad you're back here." Marcus nodded, something tightening briefly in his chest. The particular ache of being told by a near stranger something true about a person he missed more than he let himself admit. "Thank you. That means something." They stood for a moment in the kind of comfortable silence neighbors share before either of them has earned the right to real conversation, and then Donna's expression shifted just slightly, the look of someone deciding whether to say something or let it go. "Look," she said, glancing past him toward the street. "I don't want to be the welcome wagon lady who shows up with bad news, but you should know the patrol out here, it's gotten heavier the last year or so. Ever since the development company started buying up lots on Birchwood. I noticed the cars," Marcus said carefully. "You'll notice one in particular," Donna said, lowering her voice slightly, even though there was no one else around to hear. "Officer Tully, white guy built like he played football and never let it go. He patrols this stretch like he's got something to prove. My nephew got stopped walking home from work last spring, no reason given, just stood him against a fence for 20 minutes checking his pockets. Nothing came of it 'cause there was nothing to find, but Tully don't seem to need much of a reason." Marcus felt the old familiar tightening behind his sternum, not fear but recognition. He had spent 16 years reading men in uniforms, across language barriers and culture lines, learning to identify the particular posture of someone who carried authority like a weapon rather than a responsibility. He didn't need to meet Tully yet to understand the shape of him. "Appreciate you telling me," he said. "Just be careful is all I'm saying. You're new here, you keep odd hours, probably people coming and going to welcome you back and all that. Folks like Tully, they don't always wait to understand a situation before deciding what it is. I've dealt with men who shoot first and ask questions. Never." Marcus said something dry in his tone. "I think I can handle a patrol officer with a grudge." Donna gave him a long look, not unkind, but serious. "I believe you can handle yourself, soldier. I'm more worried about whether the situation handles you fair." She straightened up, tucking the dish towel back over her shoulder. "Anyway, holler if you need anything. I make a mean pot of gumbo, and I will absolutely use it as an excuse to come nose around your unpacking." She headed back toward her own yard, and Marcus watched her go, turning her warning over in his mind, the way he might once have turned over a piece of field intelligence, filing it away, not dismissing it, but not yet acting on it either. Old habits. The world outside a war zone didn't always reward vigilance the same way, but it never punished it either, and he had long ago decided that was a trade worth making. Over the next 2 days, he settled deeper into the rhythm of the house. Family came through his cousin Renee, dropping off a casserole dish that could have fed a platoon. An old army buddy, Terrell, who'd driven 4 hours just to sit on the porch and not talk about anything that mattered, the kind of visit only 2 men who've survived something together can have without a single word about what they survived. The doorbell rang more in those 2 days than it likely had in the previous 2 years, of the house sitting empty, and Marcus found himself, despite everything, starting to feel something like contentment, the specific hard-won kind that comes after a long absence from feeling anything at all. It was on the second evening, as he was carrying the last of the flattened moving boxes out to the curb, that he noticed the patrol car for the first time. It moved slow down Lindell Street, slower than traffic required, the kind of deliberate crawl that wasn't about getting anywhere. Marcus didn't react. He simply registered it, driver's side window down, despite the evening chill, a single officer behind the wheel, sunglasses on, even though the sun had nearly set. The car reached the end of the block, turned, and was gone. He thought little of it. Patrol cars patrolled. That was, in theory, the entire point of them. But the following afternoon, the same car passed twice within 20 minutes, slowing each time as it neared his house, specifically the driver's head turning fractionally toward the porch, where Marcus sat with a glass of water watching the street. The way he had once watched perimeters, not from paranoia, but from the simple muscle memory of a man trained never to stop noticing his surroundings, even in peace. By the third pass, he set the glass down and watched the car all the way to the corner. He didn't know the officer's name yet. He would soon enough. The knock came 2 evenings later, just as the last gold light was draining out of the sky over Cedar Hollow. It wasn't the easy, familiar rhythm of Donna's knuckles against the screen door. This was heavier, deliberate, the kind of knock that wasn't announcing a presence, it was issuing a demand. Marcus set down the glass of water he'd been holding, the condensation cool against his palm, and felt something in his chest shift into a register he hadn't used in 3 weeks. Not fear, just readiness, the body remembering what the mind had tried briefly to let rest. He walked to the door. He opened the door but kept his grip firm on its edge, not swinging it wide, the old instinct of never giving up more space than necessary. 2 officers stood on his porch in the fading light. The taller one had a build like he'd once played football and never stopped carrying the posture of it. Shoulders pushed back, chin slightly raised, the particular stillness of a man who had learned that standing a certain way could do half his talking for him. His badge read Tully. Beside him stood a second officer, younger, leaner eyes darting between his partner and Marcus with the faint discomfort of someone who hadn't decided yet whether he agreed with what was about to happen. His badge read Stinson. "Evening," Tully said, in a tone that contained no actual warmth. "Mind stepping outside for a minute?" "I'm fine right here," Marcus said. His voice was level, unhurried, the voice he had used 100 times in rooms far more dangerous than this one when showing calm was itself a form of control. Tully's eyes flicked past him, scanning the visible slice of the living room behind Marcus, the boxes, the bookshelf, the glass case on the mantel, just barely in view. "Cataloging. We got a call," Tully said. "Neighbor reported a lot of people coming and going from this address. Said it looked suspicious." Marcus felt the word land exactly where he expected it to. Suspicious. He'd heard that word weaponized before in briefings about communities half a world away where outsiders decided that unfamiliar behavior meant danger. He hadn't expected to hear it deployed against his own front porch in his own country by a man who was supposed to be on the same side of the line as him. "Welcoming family home after a deployment isn't usually a crime," he said, "unless that's changed since I've been gone." Inside, his mind was already running the calculation he'd run 1,000 times in hostile environments. What does this situation actually require of me? And what is the minimum action that gets me through it without anyone getting hurt? He catalogued the angle of Tully's hips, the slight forward lean that suggested a man ready to push past a no. He catalogued Stinson's hands, still loose, still uncommitted, the body language of someone present but not yet invested. He noted the absence of a visible warrant, the absence of a supervisor on scene, the absence of anything resembling actual cause beyond a neighbor's discomfort with unfamiliar faces. This wasn't an investigation. It was a fishing expedition wearing a badge, and he had seen enough of those in enough countries, under enough flags, to recognize the species on sight, regardless of the uniform it wore. The rules of engagement here were different than any he'd trained under. No escalation of force, authorized no perimeter to hold. No team at his back, just a closed door and his own restraint as the only weapon he was permitted to use. He breathed in through his nose, slow, controlled, and reminded himself of something his first commanding officer had told him decades ago, in a briefing tent that smelled like diesel and old coffee. The man who reacts first is rarely the man who walks away clean. Stay still, stay calm, make them do something they can't walk back. Make the record, if there ever was one, show exactly who escalated and exactly who didn't. Tully's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. See, that's the thing, though. Lot of traffic at all hours for a guy who just rolled into town. Folks get nervous. When folks get nervous, we gotta check things out, make sure everybody's safe. That's all this is. You checked, Marcus said. Everything's fine. You can see that from where you're standing. Tully and Stinson exchanged a glance, the kind of silent communication between partners who'd done this routine before and knew each other's next move without needing to say it aloud. Stinson shifted his weight but said nothing. He would say very little for most of what followed, and Marcus would remember that silence later as its own kind of decision, the particular cowardice of a man who lets someone else do the damage so his own hands stay technically clean. Mind if we come in, take a look around? Tully asked, already half a step forward, testing the threshold, the way a man tests ice before deciding whether his full weight belongs on it. Yeah, Marcus said. I do mind. You got a warrant. Come on now, Tully said, voice dropping into something almost paternal, almost amused. The tone reserved for people he had decided in advance didn't deserve to be taken seriously. Don't make this difficult on yourself. I know my rights, Marcus said, holding his gaze, unblinking. No warrant, you're not coming in. That's not me being difficult. That's just how this works. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a moment where two different versions of how this could go were both still possible, hanging in the air like smoke that hadn't decided which way the wind would carry it. Marcus had felt that exact silence before the half-second before a door got kicked, or didn't before a hand went for a weapon, or didn't before a negotiation either held or shattered. He held himself still inside it, refusing to be the one who broke first, refusing to give either man on his porch the satisfaction of watching him crack. You got something to hide, Webb, Tully asked, tilting his head slightly, studying him the way a predator studies something it hasn't decided yet whether to bother chasing. No, Marcus said evenly. I've got a door and a right to keep it closed without a warrant. That's the whole of it. Right here, before anything physical happens, ask yourself something. If two officers showed up at your door with no warrant and a flimsy excuse, would you have the nerve to say no, the way Marcus did? It's easy to imagine standing your ground from the safety of watching a video play out on a screen. It's a different thing entirely, standing in that doorway in real time, knowing exactly how fast these moments can turn. Drop a comment and tell me honestly what you think you'd do in his shoes. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss them. Tully's patience, thin as it had been from the start, finished evaporating somewhere in the space of that silence. He glanced at Stinson, a flicker, nothing more, the kind of look that needed no translation between two men who had worked the same beat long enough to read each other without words, and then drove his shoulder against the door before Marcus could fully register the shift in his stance. The door cracked open under the force frame, splintering slightly at the hinge, with a sound like a knuckle popping, and Marcus stepped back rather than brace against it, some old discipline, keeping his hands open, his posture non-threatening, even as fury lit up behind his ribs like a struck match thrown into dry brush. Next door, Donna Reyes had been on her porch finishing a phone call when she heard the crack of wood and looked up just in time to see Tully shoulder his way through Marcus's front door. Her stomach dropped, the phone nearly slipping from her fingers. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once before, years ago, when officers had done the same thing 2 houses down from her sister's place, and nothing good had ever come from what followed it, not for the family on the receiving end, and not for anyone who dared to step forward afterward and say what they'd seen. Her hand moved to her phone almost before her brain caught up with the decision, thumb fumbling to open the camera app, fingers trembling slightly as the screen blinked to life and the frame steadied on the open doorway. She thought of her son, roughly Marcus's age, currently on probation for a charge that should never have stuck the way it did, and felt the cold logic of fear settle into her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Film this, and risk becoming a target herself, drawing exactly the kind of attention to her own household that could end with her son back in a cell over something that wasn't even his, or look away and let it happen unrecorded, the way so many things had happened unrecorded before smartphones existed to argue otherwise. Her thumb hovered for 1 full second over the red record button, caught between 2 kinds of fear. Then she pressed it anyway, hands unsteady, and started filming, because some part of her had already decided that whatever this cost her watching in silence would cost her more. Inside, Tully stepped through first, slow and deliberate, his eyes sweeping the living room like a man surveying property he already considered his to assess and catalog. "Nice place," he said, trailing a hand along the back of Marcus's couch, fingers dragging idly across the fabric. "Real clean, real put together, almost too put together, you ask me." Marcus said nothing. He had decided somewhere in the half-second after the door splintered that he would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction, would not hand him a single second of footage or testimony that could later be twisted into provocation. Stinson followed behind, hesitating at the threshold for just a half-second longer than his partner had a flicker of something like doubt crossing his face, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he stepped over it, literally and otherwise, and moved into the house behind Tully, his boots heavy and deliberate on the hardwood. Tully drifted towards the mantel drawn by the glass case sitting there, its small brass coin and ribboned medals catching the lamplight in a way that seemed almost to invite his attention. He picked up the case without asking, turned it over in his hands, like he was assessing the weight of evidence rather than a man's entire service record condensed into metal and ribbon and 16 years of risk most people would never understand. "What's all this?" Tully said, tone somewhere between mockery and genuine curiosity, lifting the case higher to inspect it under the lamp. "Stolen valor's a real popular hobby these days. You buy these off some guy on the internet or—" "Put it down," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a register that had once made junior soldiers stand up straighter without being told, to a tone that carried 16 years of command behind 3 quiet words. Tully glanced at him, something flickering in his expression. Recognition, maybe, that he'd struck a nerve worth striking again, the particular satisfaction of a man who has found a lever and intends to keep pulling it. But he set the case back on the mantel anyway, hands raised slightly in a mock surrender that was really just theater. All right, easy." He took a step back, glanced at Stinson, and exhaled, like a man wrapping up a tedious chore. "We're good here. Nothing to find. Let's go." For exactly 3 seconds, Marcus felt his shoulders ease, the tension in his jaw loosening fractionally, his pulse beginning the slow descent back towards something resembling calm. 3 seconds of believing against every instinct. 16 years of training should have armed him with that this might end the way it should have ended from the start, with nothing taken, nothing broken. 2 men leaving a house they had no right to enter in the first place, and life on Lindell Street resuming its ordinary, unremarkable rhythm. Then Tully turned back toward the mantel, fast, almost casual in his economy of movement, and his fingers closed around the small brass unit coin sitting in its velvet slot. He palmed it in one smooth motion, the kind of practiced sleight that suggested this wasn't his first time taking something that wasn't his, and slid it into his pocket with a faint, satisfied smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth. Little memento, he said, for the trouble. The house torn open by their search smelled different now than it had an hour earlier, the dust of disturbed drawers hanging faintly in the air, mixing with the cool evening breeze, pushing through the cracked door frame and carrying with it the faint scent of someone's dinner cooking 3 houses down. Marcus could hear distantly the tick of the kitchen clock his mother had hung decades ago, absurdly steady against the chaos unfolding around it, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice and went quiet. The hallway light caught the edge of Tully's pocket, where the coin now sat hidden, a small glint of brass disappearing into navy fabric, and Marcus felt that glint land somewhere behind his sternum, like a physical blow sharper somehow than the shove at the door had been, because this wasn't force, this was theft, dressed up in a badge and a smirk and an institution that was supposed to stand for something better. "That's not yours," Marcus said, each word measured, deliberate, his hands curling at his sides before he forced them open again, forced his breathing to stay level, even as something old and dangerous stirred awake behind his ribs. "Relax, Carter, sorry, Webb, whatever your name is," Tully said, not even bothering to get it right, the disrespect almost more insulting than the theft itself. "It's just a coin." "It's not just a coin," Marcus said, and for the first time since the knock at the door, real heat entered his voice, cutting through the careful neutrality he'd maintained until now. "Men died next to me for that coin, men whose names you will never know, who bled out in places you couldn't find on a map, so that people like you could stand on porches like mine and feel safe enough to act like this. You don't get to put it in your pocket like a souvenir from a vacation you didn't earn and barely understand." Tully's expression shifted, the performance of patience cracking into something colder, more brittle. "You getting aggressive with me, Webb? I'm asking you to put back something you stole," Marcus said, voice steady despite the fire underneath it. "That's not aggression. That's the law you claim to be enforcing applied to you instead of me for once." Stinson, still near the hallway, shifted his weight again, glancing between his partner and Marcus, with an expression that for just a moment looked almost like shame, the particular discomfort of a man watching something he knows is wrong and choosing again to say nothing about it. He opened his mouth slightly as if some half-formed objection had risen in his throat, then closed it again. The silence stretched taut and dangerous, the kind of quiet that exists right before something breaks, that cannot be unbroken. Tully's jaw tightened. He looked at Stinson and something passed between them, a decision made without words, the way partners who'd worked together long enough sometimes communicated entirely through posture and glance, an entire conversation compressed into half a second. "We've been patient with you, Tully," said, voice dropping into something harder, more performative, the tone of a man building a case in real time for whatever report he intended to write later, already rehearsing the language he would use to justify what came next. "But you're getting real aggressive, Webb, real aggressive, and I don't appreciate it." "I haven't moved," Marcus said quietly, holding perfectly still to prove the point. "You broke into my home, you stole from me, and now you're standing in the wreckage of both, deciding to write a story where I'm the threat in it." Tully's hand drifted toward his belt, not drawing yet, but positioning the universal warning gesture of a man preparing to escalate and wanting an excuse already half-written in his head. Before he did it, a story forming in real time that bore no resemblance to the truth unfolding in front of him. Marcus didn't move. He had been in rooms before where the wrong motion meant someone didn't go home. He knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had survived exactly this kind of math before, that stillness was the only language that might still reach whatever reason remained in the room, if any reason remained at all. But reason, it seemed, had already left the building the moment that coin disappeared into Tully's pocket, and what remained now was only the question of how far this would go before it stopped. Stinson's eyes moved from his partner's hand hovering near his belt to Marcus's open, empty palms, and for a moment Something almost like sense flickered across his face. The dawning, uneasy recognition that the man standing in front of them had given them nothing. No provocation, no reach for a weapon, no raised voice beyond what the situation itself demanded. It was the kind of moment that in a fairer world might have made him step between his partner and the man he was preparing to escalate against. Instead, he stayed where he was, weight-shifting from one foot to the other, the small, cowardly physics of a man choosing comfort over conscience. He told himself in the half-second he allowed himself to think about it at all, that Tully knew what he was doing, that there must be something he wasn't seeing, some history or pattern that justified what was unfolding. It was easier to believe that than to believe he was watching his partner manufacture a crime out of nothing but a black man's calm refusal to be searched without cause. Outside, the evening had deepened into true dusk, streetlights flickering on one by one down Lindell Street, throwing long amber rectangles across lawns and parked cars. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged. A car passed slowly, its driver glancing toward the house with the open front door and the raised voices spilling out of it, then continuing on, unwilling to stop, unwilling to look too closely at something that might require getting involved. Donna's hand remained steady now, the initial tremor in her grip settling into the focused stillness of someone who had decided fully that she would not look away no matter what came next. The porch light above her own door buzzed faintly, insects circling it in lazy orbits, indifferent to the gravity gathering 30 feet away inside her neighbor's house. Marcus felt his pulse settle into the old, familiar cadence, not racing, not panicked, but deliberate, each beat measured against the next. The particular calm of a man who has trained his body for years to treat danger as information rather than alarm. He had been here before in 100 variations, in a dozen countries, and the lesson had always been the same: the man who panics writes the ending. The man who stays still gets to read it back later and prove exactly what happened. It happened fast, the way real violence almost always does not, building gradually toward some cinematic crescendo, but arriving all at once, the gap between calm and chaos closing in a single breath that left no room to negotiate a different outcome. Tully shoved him, both hands against the chest, hard enough to drive Marcus back a full step, his shoulder catching the door frame behind him with a dull, jarring thud. "That's enough," Tully said, voice climbing into something sharper, more commanding the tone of a man narrating his own justification, even as he created the need for it in real time. "We've been real patient, but you're getting real aggressive now, Webb." "I haven't touched you," Marcus said, regaining his footing, hands still open, still visible, voice still maddeningly level. "You shoved me. That's assault, in case nobody taught you the difference between the two." Something in Marcus's training surged forward in that instant. 16 years of close-quarters combat instruction screaming at him in a language his body knew better than his conscious mind did. He could see with the cold clarity that came from years of drilling exactly this kind of moment, every possible response available to him laid out like a menu he had no intention of ordering from. He could close the distance and put Tully on the ground in under 2 seconds. He could disable both men before either fully registered what was happening, using techniques honed across 16 years and a dozen deployments in places where hesitation cost lives, not careers. The training his body carried didn't distinguish cleanly between a hostile combatant in a war zone and a hostile body in a hallway. The underlying mechanics of disabling a threat were the same mechanics regardless of the uniform that threat happened to be wearing. But he held himself back from that first lethal trained instinct with a discipline that cost him more effort than the violence itself would have cost him. This wasn't a battlefield, and the rules that had kept him alive overseas would destroy him here in a country that would not extend him the same presumption of righteous self-defense it extended automatically to the men currently escalating against him. A dead or seriously injured officer, regardless of the provocation, regardless of the eventual truth of what had happened in this hallway, would erase every fact that mattered and replace it with a single simplified headline that would follow him for the rest of his life, would follow his family, would become the only thing anyone remembered about a 16-year career built on protecting people who would never know his name. He made the decision in the space of half a heartbeat, the same way he had made decisions under fire 100 times before, weighing outcomes faster than conscious thought could track them. Control, not destruction. Contain, don't conquer. Survive this and let the truth survive it. Alongside him, intact, undamaged, ready to be told later by someone who hadn't given anyone a single legitimate reason to discredit it. Stinson moved first this time, reaching for the taser at his belt, the small device clearing its holster with a soft mechanical click that seemed, in the charged silence of the hallway, impossibly loud, almost obscene in its casualness. "Don't," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice now that made even Stinson hesitate for half a second. Not a threat, but a warning, the kind a man gives only when he genuinely doesn't want what's about to happen, when some last fragment of hope still believed this could end without anyone getting hurt. Stinson fired anyway. The twin prongs caught Marcus in the side just below his ribs, and the current hit like a physical wall every muscle in his torso, locking simultaneously, his breath catching hard in his throat, his vision narrowing momentarily to a single white point of pain radiating outward from his ribs. Pain detonated through his nervous system in a way that was almost familiar. He had been tased once before, years ago, during a training exercise designed to acclimate operators to less lethal weapons they might encounter in custody situations overseas. And that familiarity, strange as it sounded, even to him in the moment, became the thing that let him push through it, rather than be consumed by it. His body knew this particular agony had a shape, a duration, an endpoint somewhere on the other side of the next several seconds. He gritted his teeth, forced air into his lungs through the locked muscles of his chest, and ripped the prongs free with one sharp, practiced motion before either officer expected him capable of moving at all, let alone moving with purpose. What followed was not a beating. Marcus would understand later, replaying it in his mind during the quiet hours that came after that. The most important decisions he made in that hallway were not the strikes he landed, but the ones he deliberately, consciously withheld. The violence he had every justification to deploy, and chose again and again not to. He stepped into Tully's space rather than away from it, catching the man's wrist as he reached again for his belt, twisting it with controlled, precise pressure that brought Tully to one knee with a sharp, surprised gasp, rather than breaking the joint outright, though he could have easily in a fraction of the time it took to simply restrain him instead. He pivoted, using Tully's own momentum to guide him face first against the wall, pinning him there with deliberate, measured force enough to hold a man in place, nothing close to enough to injure one. Stinson lunged with the taser raised again, recovering faster than Marcus expected, and Marcus turned, caught the man's forearm mid-swing, and redirected the momentum sideways into the doorframe, the taser clattering from Stinson's grip onto the hardwood floor and skidding to a stop near the overturned bookshelf. He could have driven an elbow into the man's throat in the same fluid motion. He didn't. He simply held him there, one hand pinning Stinson's shoulder against the wall, the other keeping Tully's wrist, locked at an angle that promised pain without delivering injury, the precise calibration of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much force a given outcome required and not 1 ounce more. For 3 full seconds, both officers were immobilized, neither one able to reach a weapon, neither one able to land a blow, and Marcus stood between them, breathing hard, every cell in his combat-trained body screaming at him that this was the moment to finish it, the way 16 years of training had taught him to finish things permanently. He didn't. He held the position, controlled, contained, waiting for backup, for reason, for anyone at all to arrive and see exactly what this actually was, rather than whatever version would be radioed in afterward. It was Tully who broke the stalemate, twisting hard against Marcus's grip and managing to wrench his free hand down toward his holster, fingers scraping against the leather strap securing his service weapon. Marcus saw the motion and made the only choice available to him that didn't end in someone bleeding out on his mother's hallway floor. He released the pressure on Tully's wrist and stepped back, hands rising immediately fully open, fully visible fingers spread wide, the universal signal of a man choosing de-escalation over advantage, even after being attacked twice in his own home by the people sworn to protect it. Tully drew his service weapon anyway, breathing hard, his face flushed with the particular fury of a man who has just been physically dominated by someone he believed himself entitled by badge and by birthright to dominate instead. Marcus stood perfectly still, hands raised, and felt something settle over him that was almost peace, in the strange, terrible way that real danger sometimes produces a clarity nothing else can manufacture. He had faced down rifles in the dark, had negotiated his own survival across language barriers with men who had every reason in the world to kill him, and several good ones not to, and none of those moments had felt as genuinely precarious as this one. A panicked, undertrained hand on a weapon in a domestic hallway. No chain of command, no rules of engagement, no radio call he could make to a team that would extract him just adrenaline and wounded pride deciding in the next several seconds whether he lived or died over a stolen coin and a door that should never have been opened. There was no combat experience that fully prepared a person for the specific, particular danger of an angry man with a badge and a grudge and a gun aimed at someone who had done nothing but refuse to be searched without cause. He thought absurdly of his mother's kitchen clock still ticking somewhere behind him in the wreckage of the living room, indifferent to all of this, utterly unmoved by the question of whether he would live to hear it tick again, and found a strange, anchoring comfort in its steadiness. He kept his hands raised. He kept his breathing slow, each inhale a deliberate 4 count, each exhale matching it. He said nothing because nothing he could say in that moment would matter more than what his stillness already communicated to anyone watching, anyone recording, anyone who might one day need to understand exactly how this had unfolded. "Tully, stop." The voice came from the doorway. Donna Phone still raised her voice, cracking with a fear that had nothing performative in it at all, nothing rehearsed. "Stop. He's not doing anything. I'm filming all of this." Donna's arm had begun to shake again, the phone trembling in her grip, even as she kept the frame steady through sheer force of will. Every instinct in her body screaming at her to run back inside her own house and lock the door, and pretend she had seen nothing at all, heard nothing at all, existed nowhere near any of this. Her son's face flashed behind her eyes, the conversation they'd had just last month about staying invisible, about not giving anyone in uniform a single reason to look twice in his direction, about how unfairness had a way of finding people who'd already been marked once, and for one terrible second, she nearly lowered the phone, nearly let the fear win the argument it had been making in her chest since the moment the door splintered. Then she thought about Marcus's hands raised in plain sight, about the gun pointed at a man who had not moved an inch in nearly 10 seconds, about every story she'd ever heard secondhand that ended badly precisely because no one nearby had been brave enough to document the truth while it was still happening, while it still mattered, while it could still change anything at all. She kept filming. Her voice, when it came again, was louder, steadier than she expected it to be, surprising even herself with its conviction. "I see you, Officer Tully. I see everything you're doing right now, and so does this camera. This is the moment most people never see coming in stories like this. The second where a single witness, scared out of her mind, decides that telling the truth matters more than staying safe. Do you think you'd have the courage to keep that camera up knowing exactly what it might cost you and your own family? Or would fear win out before you even realized you'd made the choice? Let me know honestly in the comments. And if this story has your heart racing right now, smash that like button. It genuinely helps more people find videos like this one, and stories like Marcus's get seen by the people who need to see them. Tully's eyes flicked toward Donna's phone, something shifting behind his expression, not quite restraint, but recalculation. The dawning, unwelcome understanding that whatever story he had planned to tell afterward now had a witness with a recording that could contradict every word of it, in front of whoever eventually reviewed the case. He lowered the weapon slowly, jaw tight, the muscles along his neck standing out in sharp relief, but didn't holster it fully, his hand still resting near the grip like a man unwilling to fully concede, a fight he had already lost. The sound of additional sirens cut through the evening air moments later. Sergeant Hale and 2 backup units arriving in response to Tully's earlier radio call, the one he had made the instant the confrontation began, requesting assistance for what he had already started describing falsely as an assault on an officer in progress. Hale moved through the splintered front door with the brisk efficiency of a man who had walked into 100 scenes exactly like this one and had long since stopped asking too many questions before forming his conclusions, his eyes already doing the quiet, practiced work of deciding who belonged in handcuffs, before he'd heard a single account of what had actually happened. "What do we got?" he said, eyes sweeping the wrecked living room, the overturned drawers visible down the hallway, Tully still holding his weapon at a low, ready, sweat beading along his hairline. "Subject became aggressive during a welfare check," Tully said, breathing hard, already smoothing his uniform back into place, his voice settling into the practiced cadence of a report he had clearly given variations of before. "Assaulted my partner. Resisted detainment." Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with a story already being written rarely changed the ending in the moment it was being written, and that the better use of his energy was simply staying alive and unprovoked long enough for the truth to eventually catch up to the lie, however long that took. "That's not what happened," Donna called from the doorway, stepping closer, despite every instinct telling her to retreat back inside her own walls. "I have it on video, all of it. He broke the door, he stole something off the mantel, and your partner tased a man who never raised a hand against either of you." Hale's expression flickered, something like doubt passing briefly across his face, before professional caution or perhaps simple institutional habit smoothed it back into practiced neutrality. "We'll sort out what happened down at the station," he said, his tone suggesting this was a formality rather than a genuine commitment. "Right now, I need everybody to calm down and let my officers do their jobs." The handcuffs went on Marcus's wrists. A moment later, cold, efficient, the particular indignity of restraint settling over him, not as fear, but as a kind of grim, exhausted recognition of a pattern he had read about 100 times and never once expected to live through himself. He didn't resist. He had decided the moment Tully's weapon came up that compliance, total and visible and unmistakable, was the only currency that might still buy him anything resembling fairness, once this moved beyond his own front porch and into whatever system would process it next. "This is wrong," Donna said, her voice rising as 2 of the backup officers moved to put a hand on her shoulder gently but firmly, steering her back toward her own property line, away from the scene she had just spent the last several minutes documenting at considerable personal risk. "You're arresting the wrong man. I have proof. I have it all on my phone." "Ma'am, we'll need a statement," one of the officers said, not unkindly, but with the practiced patience of someone who had heard 100 bystanders insist on 100 different versions of events that rarely changed anything in the end, regardless of how much proof they claimed to be holding. Marcus was guided toward the patrol car, the splintered doorframe of his mother's house, visible behind him in the porch light, his belongings scattered through rooms that had felt just hours earlier like the first real peace he'd known in years of structured violence and structured distance from anything resembling home. The holding room at the precinct, when he finally arrived there 40 minutes later, smelled of stale coffee an industrial cleaner, the fluorescent lights overhead humming at a frequency just low enough to notice and just high enough to grate against the inside of his skull. The walls were the color of old teeth, scuffed at waist height from years of restless shoulders, leaning against them in exactly the position he now occupied. A single window, reinforced with wire mesh, looked out onto a parking lot lit by sodium lamps that turned everything the color of weak tea. The cars beneath them rendered colorless and strange. He sat on a metal bench bolted to the floor, wrists still cuffed in front of him, wearing the same plain shirt he had put on that morning to unpack boxes in his own home, a shirt that hours earlier had represented nothing more complicated than a quiet Tuesday spent settling into a life he had earned the right to live slowly. Now it felt like evidence of something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. He thought of the unit coin sitting in Tully's pocket, of the years and the names it represented, and felt a stillness settle over him that wasn't peace exactly, but was at least familiar, the particular calm of a man who has survived worse rooms than this one, and fully intends to survive this one too, however long it took. He requested calmly, and without raising his voice even slightly, a single phone call. It took the desk sergeant nearly 20 minutes to process the request, his eyes barely lifting from a clipboard, and when he finally did, he slid the phone across the counter with the bored indifference of a man who had stopped believing anyone's first phone call ever mattered to the outcome of anything. "Make it quick," the sergeant said, already turning back to whatever paperwork had his attention. "And don't waste it threatening to sue somebody. Heard that one already tonight." Marcus didn't dignify the comment with a response. He had encountered men like this sergeant before, in different uniforms, under different flags, men whose authority had calcified into a kind of permanent boredom, who had seen so many versions of the same complaint that they no longer bothered distinguishing between the ones that were true and the ones that weren't. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something colder than cruelty. A bureaucratic numbness that processed human beings the way a conveyor belt processed packages, without malice, without curiosity, without the basic effort of looking closely enough to notice when something didn't fit the pattern. He glanced down at his own hands, still cuffed, the metal biting faintly into his wrists, and thought about the strange arithmetic of the last several hours. 16 years of service, a body that carried 2 scars from places he wasn't permitted to name in casual conversation, a mother's house finally starting to feel like a home again, all of it reduced in the space of one evening to a number scrawled on an intake form, a man waiting on a bench for someone to decide whether his version of events was worth believing. He had read about this exact scenario more times than he could count, in articles he'd skimmed between deployments, in conversations with cousins and old friends who'd lived through smaller, quieter versions of it. He had never quite let himself imagine it happening to him, not because he believed himself exempt, but because a person could only carry so many fears at once, and this particular one had always seemed like someone else's weight to bear. Now it was his. He breathed through it the way he breathed through everything, slow, deliberate, refusing to let the indignity calcify into despair. Somewhere outside this building, the coin that mattered more to him than almost anything he owned was sitting in a stranger's pocket, and somewhere in that fact was the entire shape of the night's injustice, condensed into something small enough to hold in one closed fist. He dialed a number he hadn't used in months, a string of digits committed to memory the way certain numbers simply never left a person, no matter how much time passed, and waited, listening to the line ring once, twice, 3 times, the cuffs cold and unyielding against his wrists, as the precinct's fluorescent hum filled the silence around him. On the 4th ring, a familiar voice answered, gravel rough with sleep he had clearly just been pulled out of. "This better be good, Webb. It's 11 o'clock, David Marcus said, and something in his own voice surprised him. Not panic, not even real urgency, just the flat, exhausted clarity of a man stating facts. "I need you to come down to the Cedar Hollow precinct, and I need you to bring my file." David Okafor arrived at the Cedar Hollow precinct 50 minutes later, still dressed in the half-buttoned shirt he'd thrown on before driving over a slim black case held under one arm, like it weighed considerably more than its size suggested. He had served alongside Marcus for 11 of those 16 years, 2 tours, a half-dozen operations. Neither of them would ever discuss with anyone outside a very small circle, and the particular bond that forms between men who have pulled each other out of situations most people would not survive. These days, David carried federal credentials of his own, working as a liaison between the Bureau and the Department of Defense on matters involving veterans affairs and military personnel records, a job that had until tonight felt almost sleepy compared to where his career had started. During the drive over, David had run through a dozen versions of how this conversation might go, none of them pleasant. He had received exactly 2 calls like this one in his life from Marcus men like Webb did not call asking for help unless help was genuinely, urgently required, and the flat, controlled exhaustion in his old commander's voice on the phone had told him everything the words themselves hadn't. He'd grabbed the case containing Marcus's most recent personnel file without a second thought. The same file he kept updated as part of his liaison duties precisely for moments like this, moments when bureaucracy moved too slowly to protect the people it was supposed to serve, and someone with the right credentials needed to move faster than the paperwork allowed. He walked through the precinct's front doors with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had given testimony in rooms far more hostile than this one, and approached the front desk where the same bored sergeant who had processed Marcus's phone call now looked up with mild irritation at being interrupted twice in one night. "I'm here for Marcus Webb," David said, setting the black case on the counter with a soft, deliberate thud. "I need to speak with whoever's handling his processing, and I need it now." "And you are?" David opened the case without waiting for further permission, withdrawing a federal identification card that caught the overhead light along its edge, a holographic seal shifting faintly as it moved, the eagle insignia stamped clean and unmistakable across its surface. "Special Agent Liaison, Department of Defense," attached to the FBI's Veterans Affairs Division. "And the man you've got sitting in a holding cell right now is Marcus Webb, retired Commander, United States Army Combat Applications Group. 16 years of service, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. I'd like his arresting officer in this room in the next 5 minutes." The sergeant's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the bored indifference of moments earlier giving way to something more careful, more uncertain, the dawning recognition of a man realizing he might have processed something considerably larger than he'd initially assumed. He picked up a phone, murmured something low into it, and within 90 seconds the front area of the precinct had begun filling with the particular tension of an institution sensing trouble before it fully understood the shape of it. It was at that exact moment that Officer Tully rounded the corner from the booking area, still in uniform, a faint, satisfied smirk lingering at the edge of his mouth. The particular expression of a man who believed he had already won whatever contest he imagined himself to be in. He'd come out front, Marcus would learn later, specifically to gloat, to see for himself the moment his report got logged into the system as official record, the moment a 16-year veteran's name became permanently attached to a fabricated charge of assaulting an officer. "You must be the buddy," Tully said, glancing at David's credentials, without much real interest, his tone still carrying the lazy confidence of a man who hadn't yet been told the shape of what was about to happen to him. "Look, whoever you are, your friend assaulted 2 officers tonight. Resisted arrest. There's a process for a—" "Sit down, Officer Tully," David said, and something in the flatness of his tone made even the desk sergeant go quiet. He reached into the black case again, this time withdrawing a thick manila folder, and laid it open on the counter, the top page facing outward, facing Tully directly. "This is Marcus Webb's official Department of Defense service record. I'd like you to read it carefully before you say one more word about resisting arrest." The fluorescent light overhead caught the badge clipped to David's breast pocket. As he leaned forward, the small Federal Eagle catching a sliver of brightness along its raised edges, the holographic strip beneath it shifting between deep blue and silver, as the angle changed unmistakably authentic in a way that no novelty item or counterfeit could replicate. The folder's top page bore Marcus's photograph from years earlier, younger in dress uniform, flanked by a column of citations that ran the length of the page. Combat Applications Group, 16 years active service decorations that took up more lines than most personnel files accumulated in twice the time. David's voice, when he spoke Marcus's rank and unit aloud, carried the particular weight of a man stating facts he knew would land like a verdict. "Commander Marcus Webb," he said each word deliberate, unhurried. "United States Army Combat Applications Group. The man your officer just had tased, handcuffed, and dragged out of his own home was leading classified operations 8 months ago that this entire department doesn't have the clearance to even ask about." Tully's eyes dropped to the folder. The smirk did not so much fade as collapse all at once, the way a structure collapses when its foundation gives out beneath it, rather than weakening gradually, the kind of sudden architectural failure that leaves no warning between standing and rubble. The 5 seconds that followed felt to everyone standing near that counter considerably longer than 5 seconds. Tully's face drained of color in slow stages, first a paling along his cheeks, then a deeper gray settling into the hollows beneath his eyes, the particular bloodless quality of a man watching his entire version of events disintegrate in real time in front of an audience he could no longer control. The ambient noise of the precinct phones ringing somewhere down the hall, a printer grinding through some unrelated form, the low murmur of officers finishing paperwork at nearby desks, seemed to recede into a distant muffled register replaced by a high, thin ringing that existed only in Tully's own ears, the particular tinnitus of pure shock settling into a man whose body had not yet caught up with what his mind had already understood. His hand, which had been resting on the counter in a posture of casual dominance just moments earlier, went still, fingers curling slightly inward, as though trying to find something solid to grip, and finding nothing solid left anywhere in the room. A thin sheen of sweat broke along his hairline, visible even under the precinct's unflattering fluorescent light beating at his temple, before tracking a slow line down toward his jaw, the kind of sweat that has nothing to do with heat and everything to do with the body's oldest, most honest response to fear. His mouth opened, some reflexive attempt at a response, some half-formed sound that might once have become a sentence, and nothing came out at all. Just a faint, dry click of his tongue against the roof of his mouth. The sound of a man whose entire vocabulary had abruptly, completely failed him. His weight shifted almost imperceptibly from one foot to the other, the unconscious physical language of a body trying to find an exit it couldn't yet locate, every instinct screaming retreat, with nowhere left to retreat to. Behind the counter, the desk sergeant had gone equally still, pen frozen, mid-signature on whatever form he'd been completing, watching the moment unfold with the particular fascination of a man realizing he was witnessing something that would be discussed in this precinct for years afterward, retold in break rooms, long after every name involved had moved on or been forced out. Marcus, escorted out into the front area by another officer, just in time to witness the tail end of the silence, said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't allow himself even the small human satisfaction of a smile, though he would have been forgiven for it by anyone who'd watched the last several hours unfold. What crossed his face instead was something quieter, more complicated, the specific expression of a man who has been handed, after hours of carefully measured restraint, exactly what he needed without ever having to ask for it himself, without ever having to raise his voice to claim it. It was Captain Elena Brooks, alerted by a junior officer the moment David's credentials hit the front desk, who arrived next, moving with the brisk, focused energy of someone who had spent a career learning to recognize the smell of a department about to have a very bad week. She took one look at the open folder, then at Tully's bloodless face, then at the evidence bag sitting on a nearby table, the bag containing, among other items logged during Marcus's intake, a small brass coin still rattling faintly against the plastic each time someone bumped the table. She opened the bag without asking permission from anyone, withdrew the coin and turned it over in her palm, reading the engraving along its rim with the slow, deliberate attention of someone cross-referencing a memory against physical evidence she had not expected to need. Combat Applications Group, she read aloud, glancing up at the folder David had laid open on the counter, then back down at the coin, then back at Tully. This matches his unit insignia exactly. She looked at Tully, something hardening behind her expression, the professional neutrality she'd walked in with, already giving way to something closer to disgust. Officer Tully, where did this come from? Because it is not listed anywhere in the original property log your partner filed. Right here is the moment everything Tully built his entire false report on starts collapsing in front of witnesses, not later, not off camera, but right there at the front desk with everyone watching. Have you ever seen someone's confidence disappear that fast in real life? It's a different kind of satisfying than anything scripted could capture. If you're feeling that shift in the room right now, drop a comment telling me what you think happens to a man like Tully next, and don't forget to subscribe so you catch the rest of this story as it unfolds. Tully said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't incriminate him further, and some dim surviving fragment of self-preservation kept his mouth shut even as the silence stretched into something that felt to everyone watching like its own form of confession, louder somehow than any denial could have been. Captain Brooks didn't wait for an answer. She turned to a nearby terminal, pulled up Tully's personnel file with practiced speed, and began scrolling slowly at first, then with the grim mounting recognition of someone confirming a suspicion she'd carried quietly for longer than she would have liked to admit a suspicion. The department's own paperwork had apparently shared and buried 6 separate times. 2019, she read aloud, loud enough for the gathering cluster of officers near the front desk to hear clearly. Excessive force complaint. Gas station incident, teenager tackled without cause. Dismissed. She scrolled further. 2021. Broke a man's wrist during a routine traffic stop. Dismissed. Her jaw tightened with each entry, the pattern assembling itself in real time in front of an audience that included for the first time people with both the authority and the apparent willingness to actually act on it. 2023. Tasered a deaf man who couldn't hear verbal commands he never had a chance of complying with. Dismissed. She looked up, meeting Tully's eyes directly, refusing to let him look away. 6 complaints, Officer Tully. 6. All dismissed, all buried until tonight, when you decided to do it to a man with 16 years of federal service and a friend with a badge bigger than yours, standing right here to make sure it finally stuck. The precinct floor had gone almost completely silent. Every officer within earshot, suddenly very interested in paperwork. They had stopped actually reading, none of them willing to meet Tully's eyes, or Brooks's either. Stinson, who had been standing near the booking desk through all of it, said nothing, but something in his posture had changed. The loose, complicit stillness of earlier replaced now by a tight, visible discomfort. His eyes flicking repeatedly toward the exit, as though calculating how quickly he could remove himself from a room that was rapidly becoming a permanent part of his own record. Marcus stood at the center of it, wrists finally free of the cuffs that had been removed the moment David's credentials confirmed his identity, and felt for the first time since the knock at his door hours earlier something loosen in his chest that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with the simple, exhausting relief of being believed. David crossed the room to stand beside him, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "You good?" "I'm standing," Marcus said, which was as close to an honest answer as he could manage. In that moment, his shoulder still aching faintly, where Tully's shove had driven him into the doorframe hours earlier. Captain Brooks turned away from the terminal long enough to address them both directly, her tone shifting into something more formal, now the cadence of a woman already drafting the language of an internal report in her head. "Mr. Webb, on behalf of this department, I owe you an apology that's going to take considerably longer than tonight to mean anything. For now, you're free to go, and I intend to make sure what happened in your home tonight gets the kind of attention it should have gotten the moment it started, not after a federal credential walked through my front door to force the issue." I appreciate that Marcus said and meant it, though some old, weary part of him had learned not to measure justice by the sincerity of the apology that preceded it, but by what actually followed afterward. Brooks turned back to Tully, who still hadn't moved from where he stood near the counter, his bloodless face slowly regaining a faint, unhealthy flush, as humiliation replaced shock in roughly equal measure. "Officer Tully, surrender your weapon and your badge. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs review of tonight's incident and the 6 prior complaints I just read aloud to this entire floor." Tully's mouth opened once more, and this time something did come out, though it carried none of the confidence it had carried hours earlier on Marcus's porch. "This is," he started, then stopped, apparently unable to locate any version of the sentence that wouldn't sound exactly as hollow as it was. "Save it for the review board," Brooks said, already turning away, already moving toward the next several hours of paperwork that would determine how much of tonight's damage could actually be undone. The days that followed moved with the particular strangeness of a life recalibrating itself after a single night had rearranged everything that came before it. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation within 48 hours, expedited by the combination of Donna's footage, Captain Brooks' own initiative, and the simple, undeniable weight of Marcus's service record sitting in the case file like an anchor nothing could argue around. Officer Tully was placed on unpaid leave pending charges that, by the end of the first week, had expanded well beyond the false report. He'd filed that night false imprisonment theft of personal property, falsifying an official police record, and a renewed examination of the 6 prior complaints that had been quietly dismissed across 4 years of his service. Officer Stinson, after 2 days of silence and 1 long conversation with his own attorney, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing a statement that corroborated nearly every detail of Donna's footage and effectively ended whatever defense Tully's department-appointed counsel had hoped to construct. Word moved through Cedar Hollow the way it always did, faster than any official statement carried porch to porch and phone call to phone call. Some neighbors stopped by simply to shake Marcus's hand. Others, more cautious, watched from their windows, uncertain, yet whether this was the kind of story that ended with real change, or the kind that simply got absorbed back into the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood that had seen promises before and learned not to trust them too quickly. Marcus understood both reactions equally well. He had learned across 16 years of watching institutions make and break commitments in places far from home that hope and skepticism were not opposites. They were simply 2 ways of surviving the same uncertain waiting period. Donna Reyes sat in her kitchen 3 days after the incident, her phone resting on the table in front of her, the video already viewed and reviewed dozens of times by investigators, but still sitting there unedited raw, exactly as she'd captured it. A reporter from the local news affiliate had called that morning, asking whether she'd be willing to speak publicly to attach her name and her face to the footage, rather than letting it exist as anonymous evidence buried inside a case file. Her hands had trembled even holding the phone during that call, the old fear resurfacing instantly. Her son's probation officer, the careful invisibility she'd spent years teaching her family to maintain the very real possibility that putting her face on the news might paint a target on her own door, the way it so often did for people who spoke up in neighborhoods like hers. She thought about hanging up, She thought about telling the reporter she'd already given her statement to the police, and that should be enough. She sat with the phone in her lap for nearly 20 minutes. After the call ended, staring at nothing in particular, running through every version of what could go wrong if she said yes, and every version of what would simply continue happening if she said no. Then she thought about the look on Marcus's face in that hallway, hands raised, saying nothing, trusting that someone somewhere would eventually believe what actually happened over what got reported. She thought about every story that never got told because the person holding the only proof decided the risk wasn't worth it. Every silence that had let a pattern like Tully's run 6 complaints deep before anyone with power bothered to notice. She picked the phone back up, dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it again, and when the reporter answered, she said the only thing that felt true: "Yes, I'll do it. Just tell me when." The press conference took place 6 days later on the steps of the city courthouse beneath a sky the color of wet concrete that threatened rain and never quite delivered it. A small crowd had gathered: local reporters, a handful of community organizers who had been pushing for police reform long before this incident, gave them a fresh headline to attach it to, and a scattering of Cedar Hollow residents who had come simply to stand witness to something that felt for once like it might actually matter. Donna stood at a podium for the first time in her life, her hands gripping its edges tightly enough that her knuckles paled, her voice unsteady through the first sentence, and then gradually finding the same steadiness it had found in Marcus's hallway 6 nights earlier. "I filmed what I filmed because I couldn't convince myself that looking away was the safer choice," she said, reading from notes she'd rewritten 4 times the night before, her voice catching slightly on the word safer before pushing through it. "I have a son. I know exactly what it can cost a family to be visible in the wrong moment, but I also know what it costs everybody when nobody's willing to be visible at all." Marcus Webb served this country for 16 years and came home to officers who couldn't be bothered to ask a single question before tearing his house apart. That's not an isolated mistake. That's a pattern 6 complaints deep, and it only stopped this time because the camera was running and because the man on the other end of it had the kind of record nobody could argue with. Most people who go through what he went through don't have either of those things. I want that to change. That's why I'm standing here. Marcus, standing several feet behind her during the press conference, hadn't planned to speak at all, but found himself stepping up to the podium when the reporter's questions turned toward him directly. "I don't have anything dramatic to add," he said, his voice carrying the same measured calm it had carried through every moment of that night. "I spent 16 years overseas being told I was protecting something worth protecting. I came home and had to prove with a federal credential and a stack of paperwork that I deserved the same basic respect I extended to people in countries that had no obligation to extend it back to me. That's the part I want people to sit with, not the ending. The fact that the ending required this much evidence at all." A reporter pressed further, asking whether he felt vindicated by the swift response once his identity became known. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Vindicated isn't the word I'd use. Relieved, maybe. But mostly I keep thinking about the version of that night where David doesn't pick up the phone, where I don't have a record like mine to fall back on. That version happens every day to people who don't have either of those things, and nobody holds a press conference for them." The civil suit, filed within the month by an attorney David had personally recommended, moved faster than such cases typically did, propelled by the strength of Donna's footage, Stinson's cooperation, and the simple optics of a department that had ignored 6 prior complaints against the same officer. The city settled rather than risk a trial that would have aired every detail of Tully's record in open court, and the final number 7 figures enough to rebuild not just a house, but an entire chapter of a life, arrived alongside a formal department policy review that would carry in the local paper's coverage an informal name that stuck longer than anyone expected. The Webb Protocol, a revised set of guidelines around warrantless searches and welfare checks that several officers privately admitted should have existed years earlier. Marcus read about the settlement on his porch one evening, the same porch where Donna had stood with her phone raised 6 nights earlier, and felt none of the satisfaction he might have expected. What he felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness that follows any long fight regardless of whether you win it. He thought about the months ahead, depositions, the slow grinding machinery of a civil case reporters who would call periodically for updates long after the story stopped feeling urgent to anyone but him. A week later, Captain Brooks herself drove out to Cedar Hollow, parking in front of the house that still bore a faint repair seam along its front door frame, and asked Marcus somewhat unexpectedly whether he'd consider a seat on the newly formed Community Police Oversight Board the city was assembling in the wake of everything that had happened. He declined at first. He told her honestly that he'd spent 16 years inside institutions and had earned, he thought, the right to spend some time outside one for a while, building something quieter, something that belonged entirely to him. She left her card anyway, told him to think about it, and he found himself over the following days doing exactly that, turning the offer over the way he might once have turned over a piece of intelligence, weighing what it would cost him against what it might prevent for the next person who opened their door to a knock that shouldn't have come at all. In the meantime, Cedar Hollow itself seemed to exhale collectively in the wake of the settlement announcement. The patrol cars that had once crawled past his house with deliberate slowness now passed at a normal pace, drivers facing forward, no longer pausing to study the porch the way Tully once had. Whether that was genuine reform or simple institutional caution following a lawsuit, Marcus couldn't yet say, and he'd learned not to mistake the absence of visible harassment for the presence of actual change. Real change, if it came at all, would show up slower and quieter than a press conference in policy manuals. Nobody outside the department would ever read in training sessions that either reached officers or didn't. In the next welfare check that either required a warrant or found some new pretext to skip one, Donna came by one evening with a pot of gumbo exactly as she'd promised weeks earlier, before any of this had happened, before her name had appeared in 3 different news segments, and her face had become briefly a recognizable symbol of a particular kind of courage. She set the pot down on his kitchen counter without ceremony, the same way she might have done it on any ordinary Tuesday, and the two of them sat at his table for a while without discussing the case at all. Just neighbors eating dinner, talking about nothing more complicated than the weather and her plans to repaint her porch railing before summer. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked, eventually not specifying which part of the night he meant, trusting she would understand. Donna considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. Some nights, she admitted, "Mostly, I think about what I'd have regretted more. And it's always the same answer. I'd have regretted staying quiet 100 times worse than I regret anything that came after speaking up." Marcus nodded, slowly turning that over, the way he turned over most things now, not as a soldier calculating risk, but as a man finally allowing himself the slower, more deliberate process of simply thinking something through without urgency attached to it. The unit coin sat back in its case on the mantel, recovered intact from evidence weeks earlier, its surface unmarked by anything that had happened to it in the interim, as though it had simply waited out the entire ordeal with the same patience Marcus himself had been forced to learn all over again. 3 months passed before the final pieces settled into place. Officer Wade Tully was formally terminated from the department in the 2nd month, the Internal Affairs Review concluding what most of the precinct had quietly believed for years, that his 6-complaint history represented not a series of isolated lapses, but a sustained pattern the department had repeatedly chosen not to confront. The criminal charges followed shortly after false imprisonment theft and falsification of an official record, each carrying its own weight, each one a direct consequence of a single night he had clearly believed would end the way every previous complaint against him had ended buried quietly in a file nobody would ever read twice. He was indicted within the month, and the case moved toward trial with a swiftness that surprised even David, who had seen plenty of departments slow-walk accountability until public attention drifted elsewhere and the cameras pointed somewhere new. Marcus followed the proceedings from a careful distance, declining most interview requests that came in the weeks after the indictment. He had said what he needed to say at the press conference. The rest, he decided, belonged to the courts and to whatever process existed to determine what 6 years of unaddressed complaints actually cost a department willing to keep looking away from them. Officer Ray Stinson's path diverged sharply from his former partners. His cooperation with investigators beginning that very first week continued through formal depositions and eventually a sworn statement that corroborated every material detail of Donna's footage. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to a reduced charge, a plea that acknowledged his complicity without erasing it, a small partial redemption that asked nothing close to forgiveness and offered nothing close to absolution. Marcus, when he learned the terms, felt no particular satisfaction in it either way. Stinson had stood in that hallway and said nothing while a man was tased for refusing an illegal search. Cooperation afterward didn't undo that silence. It simply meant he'd eventually found too late to matter for Marcus, but perhaps in time to matter for someone else, the words he should have used in the moment itself, when they would have actually changed something. He ran into Stinson once weeks later in a hardware store on the edge of town, both of them reaching for paint supplies in the same aisle. Stinson froze for a moment, visibly uncertain whether to acknowledge him at all. Marcus gave him a single measured nod, not forgiveness, not absolution, just the acknowledgement of one man recognizing another had chosen eventually to tell the truth when it cost him something to do it. Stinson nodded back, said nothing, and that was the entirety of their exchange. It felt to Marcus like exactly the right amount. He thought about that brief exchange often in the weeks that followed, turning it over, the way he turned over most encounters now, slowly, without the urgency that had once defined how quickly he processed every interaction in his life. There was something almost instructive in it. He decided the way silence could mean two entirely different things depending on when it arrived. Stinson's silence in that hallway had been complicity. His silence in the hardware store aisle was something closer to shame, an acknowledgement too late to undo anything, but at least honest in its discomfort. Marcus didn't know which kind of silence most people defaulted to when the moment actually arrived, when the choice was live and immediate rather than theoretical. He only knew which kind he hoped going forward more people would find the courage to avoid altogether. The Oversight Board's first meeting was scheduled for the following month, and Marcus had already begun reading through the department's existing policy manual in the evenings, a yellow legal pad filling steadily with notes and questions he intended to raise once the sessions began. It felt strange doing homework again at his age in a context that had nothing to do with combat doctrine or mission planning. It also felt somehow like exactly the right next thing to be doing with the years he had left to give. On a warm evening in early autumn, Marcus stood on his porch, watching the last of the daylight fade gold and then violet over Cedar Hollow's rooftops, the unit coin resting in his palm where he'd been turning it over absently for the better part of an hour. David sat beside him in a borrowed lawn chair, and Donna had pulled hers across from her own yard. The three of them gathered the way neighbors and old friends gather when the urgency has finally drained out of a story and only its quieter aftermath remains. Marcus studied the coin's familiar weight, the engraving worn slightly smoother now than it had been 3 months earlier, though nothing about its surface had actually changed. Only his understanding of what it represented had shifted, deepened, taken on a second layer of meaning he hadn't asked for and couldn't have anticipated. It had always stood for the men he'd served beside the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. Now it stood for something else too, for the particular cost of having to prove in his own country, in his own home, that the things he'd sacrificed for actually meant something to the people standing on the other side of a badge. He closed his fingers around it gently, feeling its edges press into his palm, and allowed himself for the first time in months to simply sit with both meanings at once, without trying to resolve them into something simpler than they actually were. "You ever decide about that oversight board seat?" David asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Took it," Marcus said. "Starts next month." David raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thought you said you'd earned the right to stay outside an institution for a while." "I did say that." Marcus turned the coin over once more before tucking it back into his shirt pocket. "Then I figured out the alternative to being inside the institution is leaving it entirely to people who've never had a badge pointed at them for the crime of having visitors over. Figured I'd rather be in the room when those decisions get made than read about them afterward in a newspaper." Donna laughed quietly, shaking her head. "Spoken like a man who's spent 16 years unable to sit still, even when he's finally earned the right to." "Something like that," Marcus admitted, a faint smile of his own, surfacing the first genuinely easy one he'd allowed himself in longer than he wanted to count. The conversation drifted, as it often did now, into smaller things. Donna's plans to finally repaint her porch railing before the cold set in, David's upcoming transfer to a new liaison post that would keep him closer to Cedar Hollow than his last assignment, had the ordinary, unremarkable texture of an evening among people who had been through something together and come out the other side of it still intact, still capable of laughing about lawn chairs and porch paint instead of lawsuits and depositions. Marcus looked out at the street, at the houses lining Lindell, at the new streetlight camera blinking its small mechanical light at the corner, and thought about how strange it was that the night which had cost him so much had also somehow given him something he hadn't expected to find again. So soon after returning home, a place that felt, despite everything, genuinely his in a way it hadn't fully felt even in the weeks right after he'd moved back in. He thought about the version of that night that almost happened, the one where his training won out over his restraint, where 2 officers ended up seriously hurt, or worse, where the story the world remembered was about a dangerous veteran rather than a corrupt department. He had chosen, in the space of seconds that allowed no time for deliberation, in any ordinary sense, the harder path, the one that cost him hours of humiliation and a stolen coin and cuffs biting into his wrists, in exchange for a truth that could survive scrutiny rather than a victory that couldn't survive a single news cycle. It had been the right choice. He believed that completely. But he also understood with a clarity that would stay with him long after the settlement check cleared and the headlines faded into older news, that the choice should never have been his to make alone in the first place, that no man should have to calculate in his own hallway exactly how much restraint his own survival required of him. That was the thought that stayed with him longest, longer than the satisfaction of Tully's conviction, longer than the relief of the settlement, longer even than the quiet pride of Donna's courage at that podium. Justice had arrived eventually for him, but it had arrived only because every single variable had broken in his favor: the right phone call, the right friend, the right paperwork, the right witness willing to risk everything to keep filming when every instinct told her to put the phone down. Take away any one of those variables, and this story ends the way so many others quietly do, unrecorded, unresolved. Another name nobody outside a family ever learns or speaks again. He didn't know yet what he'd accomplish on the oversight board, whether the Webb protocol would actually change anything beyond its own name on a policy document, whether departments anywhere would ever stop requiring this much proof before extending basic faith to the people they were sworn to protect. But he knew, sitting on that porch with the people who had stood by him when it mattered most, that he intended to spend whatever years came next trying to make the next person's version of that night require less luck than his had required. The light finished fading. Donna headed back across the yard with a promise of gumbo again soon. David stayed another hour before driving home, the two of them talking quietly about nothing in particular, the easy, undemanding conversation of men who no longer needed every silence between them filled. And Marcus sat alone on the porch for a while longer after they'd both gone, the unit coin back in its case on the mantel behind him, finally fully at rest, not because the fight was over everywhere, not because every department in every city had suddenly learned the lesson his own had been forced to learn, but because for tonight, in this one house on this one street, it was. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's this: courage rarely looks like the moment everyone remembers. It looks like staying calm when every instinct says fight back harder. It looks like raising a shaking phone anyway, even when fear is screaming at you to lower it. It looks like showing up at a podium with your voice cracking and refusing to let that stop you from finishing the sentence. Justice didn't arrive for Marcus Webb because he was the loudest person in that hallway. It arrived because enough people at enough separate moments chose the harder, quieter kind of strength instead of the easier silence. If this story moved you, do us a favor and like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe our channel so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching this story all the way through, every single part of it, beginning to end. We pour everything into telling these stories with the care and respect they deserve, and it means more than we can say that you stuck with us until the very end, all the way to this final quiet porch. We'll see you in the next one.